Would you ask Dame Melanie to come back in, please? Right, Dame Melanie, you ready to carry on, I hope?
Yes.
Well done, thank you very much. Yes, Miss Grange.
Yes, thank you. Yes, good afternoon. So when you prepared your witness statement for the inquiry, you were asked some questions about an action log dated the 22nd of June 2017, which was prepared by ZTLG after the fire, the Grenfell fire. If we could go to CLG 409955, we can see a copy of that action log. And you told us in your witness statement that you didn't know who drafted or contributed to this action log. Does that remain the position?
Yes. My guess is that it was drafted by a member of the team that we by then had in place that was managing these regular update meetings, but I don't know. I don't know who it was.
Yes. Now, page 2, if we look at page 2 of this log, in the third line down, we see a box which reads, provide one version of the truth for policy timeline since Lakanal House. Previous copies to be removed and updated with single version. And that's by someone called Rena on the 23rd of June 2017. And you tell us, if we now go to your third statement again, page 18, and look at paragraph 47, you say this, you say that, picking it up in the first line, you say the phrase single version of the truth is commonly used in the civil service when attempts are being made to collect factual information and or data, and everyone involved needs to be working from the same set of documents. On this occasion, I recall Helen McNamara rightly being concerned that there were multiple versions of the documents from 2013 onwards being collated, each organised slightly differently. This was leading to confusion. She commissioned work to produce a single comprehensive library, in speech marks, that everyone could rely on. Now, when you say that there were multiple versions of the documents from 2013 onwards being collated, can we just be clear exactly what you mean by that? Do you mean multiple versions as in multiple drafts of documents being collated?
No, I mean multiple collections in the sense that lots of different people had gone back and tried to pull out the documents. And some people had all the submissions, some people had some of them, and it was just, there wasn't a consistency.
I see. Just going back to the table and looking again at page 2 of it, CLG 409955, when the timeline states previous copies to be removed and updated with single version, copies of what? Can you help us?
I would imagine that at some point there was an index that needed to be authoritative and as near final as it could possibly be, and containing everything. And that was the sort of thing that you wouldn't want lots of versions of that, or people would start to get very confused. I don't think it was about drafts of particular documents and different versions of drafts. I think it was more about, as I say, more the index of the information.
Right.
And what happened to the previous copies when they had been removed?
Well, I don't think it was a question of deleting actual historic documents like submissions or anything like that. I really don't think that. I think this was just about making sure that people didn't carry on working from an old version, because you can see this, the cause for confusion. I mean, I suspect that the version that was produced that week remained incomplete, not quite right for some time because there was an awful lot to collect. And the inquiry, in the end, has been the process through which the department's done the really authoritative stuff.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
All right, thank you.
I mean, you tell us in your statement, I don't think we need to turn it up, paragraph 48, page 18, that in this context, the word the truth was used to mean an accurate, comprehensive record as opposed to an accurate, incomplete one and not truthful. Is that right? Is that your understanding?
Yes.
But can you explain how it was appropriate for an instruction to be given in those terms? Wasn't that a pretty misguided instruction?
What, one version of the truth?
Yes.
Well, no, that's a very common phrase, and I think people will have known what that meant, because a single version of the truth or one version of the truth is a phrase, really, that's used precisely to capture this kind of scenario where it's not about interpreting the truth, or about deleting things, and can I just be 100% clear that right from the very beginning we were clear that we knew that the inquiry was going to want to see everything, and there was an instruction within hours that nothing should be deleted.
Yes.
But I think this is actually really helpful. I think most people in the civil service will have known exactly what it meant.
Well, I mean, Helen McNamara tells us in her statement that what it was meant to read was provide one accurate, comprehensive version of the policy timeline. That's what it meant.
Yes, exactly.
But can you see how they might not be read as the same thing, that providing one version of the truth and providing one accurate, comprehensive version may be read very differently by different readers?
I find it a little bit difficult to see that, just because I'm so immersed in what that means in the civil service. Maybe you'll tell me that some found that confusing. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't involved in that meeting or in that language, but I think it's a shorthand, but a reasonably well understood one. I can well see that perhaps to the outside it might look like there's a hidden meaning in there, but I can assure you that I don't think there was. I'm certain there wasn't.
How can you be absolutely sure that across the civil service that phrase would have been considered in that way to mean accurate, comprehensive, as opposed to, well, there might be different versions of the truth by different people? How can you be sure that it had a single, well understood meaning?
Well, I mean, I wasn't involved in this specifically, but I mean, Rena, who was quite a senior person who joined us on secondment from the Treasury, was clearly charged with making sure that happened. I would hope that in the meeting she was under no illusions about what it meant, and she was clearly tasked with going and chasing that up and making sure it happened. As I said, in parallel, and I don't quite remember when this was done, but there was an instruction that nothing should be deleted, and indeed you couldn't have deleted it by then because we froze the departmental records anyway. So I would imagine there was a discussion in the meeting about the need for this, out of which this action flowed, and that was reasonably clear. So I don't myself see any particular confusion about this language, but perhaps if you're not versed in the way the civil service describes these things, this is just one of those shorthands that I've never seen as particularly difficult to interpret, but my apologies if that's not clear to others.
Yes. Well, what I'm getting at is whether some people might have read this and understood that it was potentially meaning that there might be different versions of the truth, the actual accuracy, and what you wanted was a version which was not necessarily the truth, but was one you were all going to stick to. Couldn't someone have read it that way?
Well, I mean, clearly in the context of the inquiry, perhaps you and others may have read it that way, and I can only say the audience for this was intended to be those acting on it, and I would be very worried if any of them didn't share the interpretation that I gave you in my witness statement.
Right.
I would be quite surprised if anyone thought that this was somehow supposed to be an instruction to create some narrative, because that just wasn't the way that we were behaving about this. It just wasn't. And the public inquiry had already been established, and I and Helen and Tamara and everyone really was really at pains to get to the bottom of this and not to cover anything up or delete anything. It just wasn't how we were.
Okay, thank you. Now, I wanted to ask you some questions now about the briefings that you had about the building regulations after the fire. You've already touched on this in your evidence, so you've told us a little bit already. But if we can look at paragraph 13 on page 4 of your third witness statement. You say in paragraph 13, you say, in that discussion, so you're talking about discussions with Helen McNamara and Sally Randall on the day of the fire, I recall that we were very troubled by the implications of the events at Grenfell Tower and how a fire could spread with such devastating speed on a residential building. It raised questions about whether the building regulations were sufficient and or clear enough, and or whether the building itself was non-compliant. At this stage, we had very little information and did not know whether Grenfell Tower was a one-off or part of a wider systemic failure. But it was already clear there could be wider implications for public safety. These underlying questions about the building safety system and what had gone wrong were a significant preoccupation for me in the following weeks, as I described below. And it looks like you asked for a briefing on the building regulations. Is that right?
I certainly had a briefing on the building regulations, I believe the following Tuesday, so nearly a week later.
Yes, if we can look. Well, there's a couple of emails
I don't
on
recall
this.
when I asked for that. I don't think it was that afternoon, but it
Okay.
might have been.
Let's look at a few emails that might help prompt a recollection. If we go to CLG 402935, and we look at the second email down on page 1, we can see there's an email dated the 14th of June 2015 at 13:19 from your office to the office of Joe Farrer and to Helen McNamara, copying others in. And if you look at the fourth bullet down, or fourth point down, it says MD Melanie Dawes would like to have a briefing on the building reg situation when she is back into the office. Helen/Joe, I've put a hold in your diary for 3:30. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you remember receiving that briefing? So this is very early on the day of the fire.
I think what Ellie meant by that was that I wanted to have a meeting on the whole question of the approved documents and what had happened and what was or wasn't compliant. And that meeting was the 3:30 meeting, I think, is what I interpret that bullet to mean. It wasn't a briefing on the building regulations and the approved documents in any level of detail. That took place the following week.
Right. But who attended that 3:30 meeting? Did people from the Building Regulations Division attend?
No, I don't think so. I believe that it was Helen McNamara and Sally Randall, and my office will have been there as well. And I don't think anyone else was there, but I don't recall that.
So did you go into any details in that meeting about the building regulations, what the provisions were within them, the fact they contained functional requirements, the approved documents, any of that?
No, I mean, it was a stock take on the situation as it was that afternoon, the crisis that we were in with this terrible fire and not knowing, as I said in my witness statement, what on earth it could possibly mean, whether it was a one-off and so on. So I was out for, a good couple of hours, and I think I will have said to Ellie as I went into that meeting, can you make sure that I have a briefing with Helen? I probably will have said. I don't know why she invited Joe as well, but it may have been we were interested in the issues at Grenfell Tower itself, which Joe was leading on, but I don't think so. I think it was more just about, what's happened to these documents, what does it mean? And I think I've described in my witness statement the sort of things we discussed.
Yes. Now, if we look up the email chain, we can see that Sally Randall then sends an email to Helen McNamara later that day. And she says the following. She says, my immediate thoughts, in terms of the speed of government response, we need to look at both the original decision to wrap this up into a wider review of building regs, which was always scheduled to take 4 years. Was that the right call on something with safety implications, ? And then the delay in meeting that timetable, which I'm sure will have been accrued over the period and not just relate to ministerial pressures in the last few months. And she says also, to be absolutely clear, given the pressure on Steve Q and Bob today, building regs was part of my team for a significant chunk of this, from end of June 2014 to May 2016, yes?
Yes.
Now, were those topics discussed during the briefing that you had then later in the day? Just in general terms.
I don't know. I mean, I'm pausing because, I should say I think this is a really good example of Sally just owning what had happened and accepting responsibility for the fact that she'd been leading this work for some time, and she didn't want it all to fall on Steve Quartermain and Bob Leadsom, and she wanted us to know that she had been part of this. And I just think that Sally was like that always, and very constructive, and always owned her own role in these things. And so she's raising here two really important issues.
Yeah.
I don't know whether we, which I agree with them, they were two really important questions. I don't know whether we got to them that afternoon. I think I recall that quite quickly we were moving on to just, is this a one-off?
Yeah.
There were people out there in the media, people telling us it must be a one-off, it must be a one-off. And there were others saying, well, it won't be because there's actually combustible cladding everywhere and this has been a problem for some time. And so the following morning we'd set up the testing programme and the checks. And I think that very quickly became our focus. Where else could this have happened? Rather than going over in detail why it was that we hadn't met the deadline, because that was a fact.
Yeah.
And I think if Sally had thought that the regulations were part of the immediate solution, she would have said so. And, as you know, the following week, the Secretary of State decided not to go ahead with the publication of the draft document that had been prepared. So we quite quickly moved on from the regulations, which isn't to say that we weren't aware of the failure, but we were dealing with the crisis and it didn't feel like an important part of what we needed to be addressing right then.
Yes. And that phrase in the last sentence, given the pressure on Steve Q and Bob today, was that the particular pressure of the Grenfell Tower fire? Or?
Yeah, they were in the firing line because, they were accountable for the work
Yeah.
and for the delay. And she was just saying, I was involved in this too.
Yeah. Now, it also appears, and again, you've alluded to it before, that you had a meeting with Brian Martin later in June 2017. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, let's look at an email relevant to that. It's at CLG 406578. And if we look at the second email down here on page 1, we can see that on the 23rd of June 2017, Brian Martin emails your office, and the subject is Scottish Report on Failures in Construction Industry. Yes. And it reads, hi, when Melanie popped down to speak to the building regs team, she asked about failures in the construction industry. I mentioned a report on failures in Scotland that she was interested to see. This BBC report summarises the report. I haven't found the report online. I'm sure it's there somewhere. And he attaches a link to an Architects Journal article about poor construction and lack of scrutiny caused by Scottish schools' defects. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And then at the top email in the parent, we can see that Mr. Martin states, further to my earlier email, I've now found a copy of the Cole report. Melanie will wish to see this. Brian, do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Now, taking this in stages, first of all, had you ever met Brian Martin before this time and in your role as permanent secretary?
I can't say for sure, but I don't think so, no.
What was your understanding when you met him about the nature of his role?
So, to the best of my recollection, the first time I met him and other members of the building regulations team was on the Thursday morning, just after the fire, because I went down to see them. I didn't go down to have a meeting with them, but I just went down to say hello, really, and my prime purpose was just to give them a bit of support and just check they were okay, because obviously what they were going through, can't compare remotely with those that were experiencing the effects of the fire, but I knew they were having a really tough time because they'd been involved in this work for some time, and I thought that just to go down and say hello was quite important. So we had a brief chat. I remember it quite well. We were standing up. It was probably for about 10 minutes, and Brian must have been one of those. I don't particularly remember, actually, but there were about 5 or 6 people, and we just had a quick huddle and a quick chat. And I think that's probably the meeting that Brian's referring to, the popping down, because that would be a good description of what I did. I popped down.
Right. But was there a separate meeting with Mr. Martin and his team when you received more detail from them?
Yes. So I believe that meeting took place on the Tuesday after the fire. I don't quite know why I'm so clear that it was the Tuesday, but I'm pretty certain it was. And that was a meeting specifically to go through the building regulations.
Yeah.
We were being told that the regulations didn't allow combustible cladding of the type on Grenfell Tower, but I and the Secretary of State both felt we wanted to delve into that and to understand it and to read the document ourselves and almost see it between the eyes, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And so Sajid Javid sent his special advisor Nick King, and Nick and I and a couple of others, I think maybe Tamara Finkelstein had already joined us by then, in fact, sat down with Brian, the lawyers. I don't think there were many others. I'm not sure Bob was there, actually.
Richard Harrell, was he there?
I can't remember.
Yeah.
Brian was the main person, and he took us through those paragraphs 12.5 onwards. That was the main. And I think he also explained to me how the system worked.
Yeah.
1984 Act, etc., the functional requirements and the whole way it was supposed to work.
Okay. By whom had you been told before that Tuesday meeting that the regulations did not allow combustible cladding?
I can't recall a moment when I heard it directly, but it was one of the very first questions that was being asked, and my guess is that it was asked at the 8:30 meeting on the Wednesday, the 14th, with Sajid Javid and me and others, and if it wasn't asked then it will have been asked later on, and it almost certainly was one of the things that we discussed at the 3:30 meeting that afternoon.
In terms of this
Sally and
Tuesday
Helen. My apologies.
In terms of this Tuesday meeting, are there any notes of the meeting? Did anybody take any notes or minutes?
I don't know. Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
If there were any minutes, it's the sort of thing we would have disclosed to the inquiry.
And can you remember how long it lasted, that meeting, to talk about the building regulations and the approved documents?
Probably closer to an hour than half an hour. So 45 minutes to an hour is my guess. I think it was quite detailed and quite thorough, and there weren't very many of us. So, I took the opportunity to ask a lot of questions, and so did Nick King.
Yeah. And where physically did that meeting take place?
It took place in my office.
Yeah. And Mr. Martin says in his email that you asked about failures in the construction industry. That might not be at the same time. That might have been earlier. But is it right that at some point you'd been asking about failures in the construction industry?
Yeah, so I hadn't seen this email before, and I may or may not have been shown the report by my private office. They may not have thought I had time to read it, I don't know. But when I popped down to see them on that Thursday morning, I remember asking them what they thought had happened, and they said to me that they thought that products had been substituted on the site, and that was the only way they could explain it, because it was so clear. I don't recall them specifically saying this, but I think they probably did, that those materials shouldn't have been used at Grenfell Tower.
Right.
And looking at this now for the first time, I think it's probable that we had a bit of a discussion about the construction industry and failures, because that would have been consistent with what they were saying they thought had happened, and that maybe is why we talked about the Scottish report. I can't quite remember, but that seems probable to me, that might have been what happened.
Yes. And at the Tuesday meeting, did you actually have copies of the approved document in front of you?
Yes.
So you were looking at section 12 on external walls?
Yes.
And did you discuss in detail the clarity of that guidance in terms of... now, did you look at it from the point of view of the insulation as well as the external wall panels? Did you go into that level of detail?
Yes, we did. And we challenged quite hard, because we had already heard from a lot of people in the industry by then. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of Lord Porter, Gary Porter, who was chairman of the Local Government Association and was at many of the COBRA meetings at the very beginning on all the aspects of the response to the fire. And Gary Porter was a builder. He knows about these issues, and he was very clear that the regulations were confusing. And so we'd heard from him and from a number of people that there were issues, and what we were trying to do is what I would often do actually as permanent secretary, was kick the tires really on the department's narrative and go, but surely this, and what people are saying is that. And we went through it line by line and talked about fillers and insulation, and without having the document in front of me I can't quite but you know the issues.
Yes. Were you told that paragraph 12.7 and the reference to filler was an important part of the guidance relevant to whether these materials should have been used?
So what I remember on that day was that Brian acknowledged that without seeing the document in front of me, I can't quite pin this down, but he acknowledged that, is it because it referred to insulation, it might not be clear that it also applied to other materials.
He acknowledged that lack of clarity, did he?
Yes, I would rather be confirming this with the document in front of me, if it's at all possible to see it, and then I can be sure which bit of language was. But I remember him saying that there was, that we were going to, that we should clarify that.
Yeah.
And I remember asking, is that what we had planned in the document that we were about to publish? And the answer was, I believe, no.
Yes.
And we looked at each other and, you know, Nick King was pretty robust in challenging on all of this as well. I mean, in a very constructive and kind of fair way, but, you know, on behalf of the Secretary of State. And I was left with the feeling that the wording wasn't actually a reason for not complying with what... I didn't think that the wording was so confusing that you could think that the cladding of the type used at Grenfell Tower should have been put on that tower in the way that we were describing earlier.
Yes.
But I did leave with the impression that perhaps the team hadn't quite got on top of what any confusion might be, and that there was going to be more work that needed to be done on this.
Right, that's interesting. If we go to CLG 50224, and I think it's page 96.
Yeah.
That's clause 12.7. So I think what you said is it was recognised that the heading to this clause
That's right,
might be slightly misleading, yes?
That's right.
And who said that? Was that Mr. Martin?
We asked. I think, you know, I remember, you know, that was one of the claims, was that the heading was misleading, and I don't want to overinterpret my memory of this and to tell you more than I actually recall, but I think that Brian said, well, that's what filler material, that phrase, was designed to achieve. And we challenged and said, yes, but the whole paragraph is about insulation materials. Is products part of insulation, or is it something different? And I do remember specifically asking, were we going to change that language? And the answer, I believe, was no. I think so. I mean, I would want Brian to answer that question for himself as to what he said. But I believe he said no, and we had, as I described, a moment when we kind of went, oh, okay, well, you know, clearly there's more to do here. And I can't remember whether it was the heading or the content of the paragraph that would have been the thing that you would have, if you could have done, had your time again, would have changed.
Did anybody at the meeting point out that filler material is not defined anywhere in the approved document? Was that noticed?
I don't recall that, no.
Were you told that, in fact, there'd never been any consultation on the use of the phrase filler material?
No, I wasn't told that.
Inserted.
I mean, we didn't get into that level of detail, but I wasn't aware of that until you just mentioned it.
But that would have been a relevant thing to tell you, wouldn't it? That they'd never consulted on what the meaning of filler material was, as understood by the construction industry.
Yes, ideally. I think it probably would have come up that in that discussion. I mean, we quite quickly, the Secretary of State concluded, and I can't remember exactly where it was in relation to the timeline, but I think it was pretty much that day or the day after, the Secretary of State concluded, rightly in my opinion, that we shouldn't go ahead with the consultation document because there were just too many unanswered questions as to whether it was adequate to the task that we knew now that we were facing.
Yeah.
So it may be that was after this meeting. In fact, I think it possibly was. Is that correct? And that Nick King's and my understanding of this fed into that decision.
Right, yes. Did you look at any detail at the clause before this, which is 12.6, and diagram 40, and the requirements of 12.6 and diagram 40 for external walls? Perhaps if we can go 2 pages earlier. Sorry, 1 page earlier. There we can see 12.6 begins at the very bottom right-hand side. The external surfaces of walls should meet. And then if we go over the page, it says the provisions in diagram 40. And then diagram 40 is on the next page, page 97, if we go to that. Did anybody talk you through how clause 12.6 related to clause 12.7 and what was covered by one versus what was covered by the other?
Yes, I do remember we had a bit of a discussion of this diagram, and if I'm honest, I remember getting slightly lost at this point.
Yeah. Did anybody talk to you about national class naught and the fact that you can see in the bottom right-hand diagram any dimension over 18 metres has got to be either class naught, national class, or class B?
Yeah.
Do you remember anything being said about national class naught to you?
Yes, I do remember that, because that was one of the things that we were being told was confusing, as I've mentioned in my witness statement, and that was one of the things that Lord Porter was talking about specifically, in fact.
And did you ask about whether there'd been any confusion about the requirement for national class naught?
Yes, and I can't quite remember how Brian and others responded to that, but I remember being told that class naught was about the surface of the material and not about its content, and that it was therefore different. And I remember reading that bit of the document again and kind of sort of being able to see that and being able to see the references to cladding right at the beginning of that section of the approved document, and piecing my way through being able to understand how it was supposed to all fit together.
Yes. By this time, we know that you were aware that Grenfell Tower had been clad in ACM panels with a PE core. You tell us that in paragraph 17 of your third statement on page 6, that you worked that out pretty quickly, that it was ACM PE material, yes?
Yes, because we set the tests up to look for more of it, so we must have known that right at the beginning, yes.
Yes. Now, I'm going to put to you a series of pieces of information which we know Mr. Martin was aware of, and I want to know from you whether they were raised by him at this meeting with you.
Okay.
So did Mr. Martin tell you that he had been involved in a project including large-scale testing in 2001 at the BRE involving ACM PE panels, and which showed that such panels caused a raging inferno during an external wall fire?
No, I don't recall that.
Were you told that in 1999 a parliamentary select committee had recommended a change to the relevant guidance such that all external wall materials should be entirely non-combustible or be proven through full-scale testing not to pose an unacceptable level of risk in terms of fire spread? Were you told about that?
No.
Were you told that that recommendation had never been accepted and followed by the government?
No, we didn't go into that level of history on what had happened in that meeting. It was a narrower focused discussion than that.
Were you told that there'd been long-standing concerns about the adequacy of the national classifications, including national class naught, as a measure of fire performance?
No.
Were you told that there had been a number of warnings delivered to the department about cladding fires abroad, including in the UAE, which had involved ACM PE panels and had caused rapid external fire spread?
I was aware of those other fires quite early on. I don't recall it being discussed in that specific meeting, but I think I was aware of those fires probably by the time of that meeting.
Yes, but my question is, were you aware that your department had received a number of warnings about those fires?
No, I wasn't aware of that, no.
And that they had asked themselves the question, were these panels precluded or not? Were you aware of that?
No.
Were you made aware that Mr. Martin had been involved in several meetings and exchanges in the period 2013 to 2017, during which important industry figures, including the BRE, the NHBC, the CWCT, the Curtain Walling and Cladding Technology Group, and others had explained that the guidance in ADB was not clear about whether these ACM PE panels were permitted or not on high-rise buildings?
No, I wasn't aware of that at the time.
Did he tell you, Mr. Martin, that he had been asked to clarify the very section, 12.7, of the guidance, which apparently were important in restricting the use of ACM PE on high-rise buildings?
I think he may well have mentioned that in the meeting, yes, because it was part of the discussion we had about that section that I was describing earlier, that people had challenged it and had said that it wasn't clear. I think I was aware of that, and I think he mentioned concerns about the clarity.
But did he tell you that on numerous occasions over that period, 2013 to 2017, he'd been informed by industry that they didn't think it was clear enough about whether these ACM PE panels were permitted or not in high-rise buildings? Did he tell you that?
No.
No.
I don't think so.
And you said you had a recollection that he might have said that people had challenged it and said it wasn't clear. Were those people challenging it after the Grenfell fire and saying it wasn't clear, or people challenging it before the Grenfell fire?
Before the fire.
Right.
If I'm right that he did mention it in that meeting, then that's what I believe I'm recalling.
Did anybody in that meeting ask for more information about what challenges there had been by industry to the clarity of this guidance?
Yes, we were going through the guidance line by line, and we were seeking to understand, which were the sections, the phrases, the sentences that people weren't clear about. So that was specifically what we were trying to bring into the room. We didn't ask exactly who was making each of the claims, because we were very focused on the document. That was the main purpose of the discussion, was to understand it, and for me and Nick King to form some kind of understanding ourselves of, how clear it was, what role it might have played, that would help in particular work out what to do with the consultation document, but also kind of understand the wider system issues.
Absolutely. I understand you had a narrow focus on the
Yeah.
document, but surely it was highly pertinent to what you were discussing to know that key industry figures had been raising concerns about these clauses for some time.
Yes, and I think those concerns were part of the discussion, yes, they were.
Right. Were you informed by Mr. Martin that he had been told in early 2016 by a reputable cladding consultant that ACM PE panels were on many high-rise buildings in the UK and that the current situation was of grave concern? Were you told that?
No, I wasn't.
You should have been told that, shouldn't you?
I think so, yes, because by that stage we were testing for cladding on multiple buildings, and we were not surprised perhaps, but we were not prepared for the results when they came through, which were 100% of the tests had found ACM PE cladding.
Yes.
And I don't think, therefore, that I can have been told the point that you just made.
Yes. Were you given any estimate by Mr. Martin or his colleagues about how many other buildings might have ACM PE on it at that point, at the early stage after the fire? Did they say, well, we don't expect to find it elsewhere, or did they say, no, we already know it's on hundreds of buildings? What was said to you about that?
I can't really remember asking that question specifically of Mr. Martin. I mean, it was a question that we were asking sort of all the time, how bad could this be? How many could there be? So I don't particularly recall asking Mr. Martin that question in that meeting, or in any other meeting, to be honest.
But just to be clear, you would have expected to be told, had he been warned clearly in writing, that there were many high-rise buildings in the UK with ACM PE panels on them.
Well, yes, ideally, yes. But I suppose the context is that this was a meeting, the first proper meeting that Brian had had with his permanent secretary, I think, also with the special advisor. It was for a very specific purpose of giving us a teach-in and, having a robust kind of discussion about the particular document. So I don't remember if Bob Ledson was there, but I think he wasn't. I think it was just Brian, possibly with one other. And as I say, the lawyers were there as well. But I think it would have been asking a lot of Brian for him to have brought all of those issues out in that meeting. But I think some of the things that you've mentioned, it seems quite odd not to have mentioned them in that meeting, given the nature of the discussion we were having.
Well, I'm going to be suggesting to you that all of these matters ought to have been laid on the table and you made aware of them at this early stage, particularly those ones that were in recent time, like the warning about many buildings having ACM PE. Surely that was something that any candid civil servant would be telling you immediately.
Certainly, I agree with you on that one. Yes, that's so relevant to the discussion. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what was also relevant, wasn't it, was that Mr. Martin himself had undertaken in March 2016 to change a relevant clause in the guidance, i.e. 12.7, which was relevant to the use of these panels and which had been described as poorly worded, open to misinterpretation and misleading. He should have told you that as well, shouldn't he?
That he had made the commitment to change it. Well, I think he may have said that the team was considering changing it, but they had concluded not to, and that was the discussion I was referring to earlier. I think we did get to that section and talk about how it didn't look completely clear, and Brian acknowledging that, but then it emerged that actually the draft of the document that was about to be consulted on didn't in fact change that language, I believe. That's what I recall anyway.
Yes. But
So I think we did have that discussion a bit.
But shouldn't he have told you that he was sat in a meeting with senior industry figures in March 2016, at which time he accepted to change this poorly worded clause, which was misleading?
Yes, I mean, whether he mentioned a specific meeting or not, I should have mentioned a specific meeting or not, but I certainly think that the issue of the confusion should have been raised, and it was in part in that discussion. But so, yeah, I mean, I think we have to be, I don't think we can sort of say Brian should have mentioned every single one of these things in a reasonably short meeting where I was asking a lot of questions and Nick King was asking a lot of questions, but that general sense of informing us quite the degree of concern in the various different ways you've brought forward there was out there. Yes, some of that should have been brought into the meeting more than it was. I do agree.
But even if not at that meeting, surely, shortly thereafter, you should have been told all of the things I've just gone through, right back to the testing in 2001 on ACMPE, what the Parliamentary Select Committee had said, the number of warnings about ACMP cladding fires, the number of industry figures that had raised concerns about the clarity of the guidance, the fact you knew that ACMPE was on many buildings. Surely that was highly relevant information for you and others around you at that time, Helen McNamara and others, to be told very soon after the Grenfell Tower fire.
Yes, I think it was, and some of that I was aware of because I'd read the early version of the record that Simon Ridley had commented on the previous week. So I was aware, for example, of the APBG correspondence and some of the other aspects, but I wasn't aware of what the team had been told. We didn't know that until a lot later.
Yes. When did you know, a lot later, all the warnings that the team had been told and what meetings they'd been involved in, the warnings about this clause in particular? When were you told that?
I think I've learned about the full history as I've prepared for today's hearing and read everybody's witness statements and read the chapter and verse on what everybody says happened during those years. Richard
Right.
Carroll and Bob Leadsom and Brian.
Yeah.
And
So in preparation for this
Amber.
inquiry?
Yes. But we didn't seek to investigate that. I didn't launch an investigation into what had happened. Perhaps I should have done at the time, but we were concerned to try to fix the problem and set up the building safety programme to look at what was going on out there on buildings across the country. And that, together with the Hackitt review, together with the public inquiry, felt like quite a lot of investigations that were already going on. So we didn't look into the department's handling of this at the time. And I thought that was where the inquiry would actually most help us, if I'm honest, as well.
No, I appreciate that, but it didn't need an investigation, did it, for those that had been involved to make sure that you were aware of those matters?
I think given that there were incredibly important issues of public safety that were by then absolutely clear, it would have been helpful to know sooner the extent of the concerns that had been expressed to the team about how much ACM cladding was out there, because as I say, we were not really expecting quite the scale of what we found.
Yes. Now, you say that a decision had been taken, or he explained, not to change that language. Did Mr. Martin explain why that decision had been taken, not to change that language?
No, I don't think so.
Right, because this is the first we've heard of a decision not to change it. Because kind of interested in what you can tell us about
Let
that.
me be really clear about what I remember in that case. So, would you mind just confirming that the consultation document didn't change the language? The version of the
There was
document
nothing
that was
in the
about to be published? Yes.
That's right. There
Thank
was
you. That
nothing
was
in the
my-
discussion document.
So that's what I recall, is that we talked about that section, and Brian acknowledged that this was an area that was a bit confusing and that they had some concerns about it, and I asked, were we going to change it then? And the answer was no. And as I said, I think with probably a little bit of a pause, because it was clear that wasn't okay. And I don't recall asking him why, and I don't recall him answering or giving me an answer as to why.
Yeah. What was your reaction when you were made aware of the number of warnings the department had received about these matters before the fire, about ACMP being on buildings in the UK, about that clause being unclear, or the guidance in ADB being unclear? What was your reaction when you realised that?
Well, my reaction is at a number of different layers. At the heart of this, I think, is what I was describing this morning, is a complete failure throughout the preceding decades for the department at any level to see that there was a system oversight role that needed to be played, let alone that the department was accountable for playing it. And so the team were never given any instructions that their role was anything more than maintaining the documents. And so to that extent, I think that when I looked at, when I read the witness statements of departmental officials and also others who were involved in the NHBC, BRE and so on, what I draw from that is that there just wasn't a system for any of this to go to. There wasn't a place for it to go to. There wasn't any sense of people who were listening, or a log, or a risk register, or a data collection system, or anything like that. And in fact, the department's overall operating framework was one where the industry were doing the detail and local government were doing the oversight, the approvals and the enforcement. So I think that made it difficult for the team probably to know quite what to do. Having said that, these were issues of public safety, and there was technical confusion, and some of that was about the documents themselves, which was the core responsibility of the department and understood as such. And so I read that narrative and see quite a lot of missed opportunities within the team, as well as the enormous missed opportunity by the department as a whole over a number of decades.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've got the point, but can we agree that it's one thing not having a system, and that is a problem and a failing, but some of this surely was common sense in terms of the need to escalate these matters to seniors and the need to do more than just sit on the problem, yes? Can we agree that? It was common sense that you couldn't just do nothing.
Yes, I agree. And I think the department did have the right kinds of cultures and certainly, reasonable processes by which these things could have been escalated. It wasn't an enormous department. People saw each other. They bumped into each other. I think it wasn't a place where conversations were impossible to have.
Yes. When did you first learn about the 2001 test on ACMPE? When were you first made aware of that?
It's possible that I was aware of it in the months after the fire in 2017 and 2018, when we were putting in place the building safety programme, because I went to the BRE at one point and looked at videos of various tests, had a long conversation about the large-scale tests and how they were conducted, watched one of them done actually live, and so it's possible that at that stage I was told of some of the history. but I don't specifically recall. And the moment when I particularly pieced all this timeline together in my own mind was more recently when I prepared for today's hearing.
Yes. I mean, looking back on that meeting, can we agree that you were not given full and frank assistance by Mr. Martin in terms of the candour that he ought to have been displaying at that meeting, given the number of things that were important that you should have been told there and then or very shortly thereafter?
I didn't feel at the time that Brian was lacking in candour or honesty about this. He gave a very practical and detailed and clear account of the regulations and how they were supposed to work. So he did, explain, albeit that it led to quite an awkward conversation to him, that there had been concerns about that bit of the document, that they'd thought about addressing them and then weren't going to, and the document was about to be published. So I didn't leave that meeting thinking that Brian was lacking in candour and honesty. With hindsight now, knowing what I know, I think it's surprising that he or others in the team didn't raise some of those issues. Yes, I do, but I guess that was part of a pattern that had been going on for a number of years. So the habits were not there to be raising these things.
Yes, but 72 people had died by that point.
Know.
There'd been a major disaster. Can we agree that looking at it now, you could have reasonably expected more candour from your team in terms of those matters in the days after the fire?
Yes.
By the time of this meeting with Mr. Martin, were you aware of any international cladding fires involving ACMPE?
I can't quite remember exactly when I was aware of the fires in Dubai and France in particular, but I believe it was quite soon after the fire because it was part of the conversation about how it had happened elsewhere.
Yes. I mean, we know that those fires, there was a spate of them in the UAE in 2012, 2013, and then there was a further spate during your time as Permanent Secretary in 2015, 2016. Some of those were reported in the mainstream news, including in the BBC. Is it the case that nobody brought those fires to your attention as Permanent Secretary?
Yes, I don't remember them at the time.
Yeah. Would you have expected people within your department, in that Building Regulations division, to have brought those fires to your attention and to explain to you the extent to which the regulatory regime here either did or did not deal with those?
I certainly would, yes. And it was a system we put in place after the fire. It took quite a lot of pushing, I have to say, because there were fires, quite frequently after Grenfell Tower, and every single time I and my ministers were incredibly keen to know immediately what had gone on. Was it related to cladding? Was it related to any other combustible materials? How had the fire started? I mean, obviously we wanted to know what had happened and whether people were okay, but then immediately, what had caused the fire? Was it relevant to what we were looking at on building safety? Did it raise other issues, new issues that we needed to be worried about, given that the scale of the problem was opening up in front of our eyes all the time anyway? And it was quite tough to get the department to be able to answer those questions, and it took several goes before we got to a stage where we were getting hourly updates. I think in the end we had to put it into the red team, who were used to that kind of situation reporting. Yeah. And then that was partly because I think the fire teams had gone to the Home Office and the links weren't quite as strong as they had previously been. So the difficulties I had putting in place that system, for me sort of illustrated quite what hadn't been there before as well.
Yes, I understand. Can we just look at your witness statement again, the third statement, page 6, paragraph 18. You tell us there, so you say, over the following weeks, I inquired into these questions, and by that I think you mean questions about system failures across the construction industry to observe fire safety standards, which is what you've been discussing previously. And you say you did that by reading the background documents, including some of the transcripts of the Lakenal House inquest and reports of previous fires over the past 20 years. I also spoke to people in the fire service and the industry. Yes. Now, which reports of previous fires did you read? Did you read, for example, the 1999 Select Committee report following the Garnet Court fire in Irving in Scotland?
I think I might have done, yes. I can't recall now exactly which documents I read. It was the submissions, the APPG correspondence. It was some of that library of documents that we've been discussing so far, but and then it was also some of the external documents as well.
Yes. And which people did you speak to in the fire service and industry? Can you just briefly help us with that?
I spoke to Roy Wilshire and Sir Ken Knight, with whom we were already working. I believe I also spoke to Peter Bonfield. I spoke to a number of housing association chief executives, David Montague, I believe, and others. I was also, by the time we got to about a fortnight after the fire, I was talking to local authority chief executives as well, particularly those who had already discovered ACM-clad buildings. So I didn't speak to sort of lots and lots of people. I just spoke to a few and just was asking questions. Yeah.
Did it occur to you at any time at this point to do any form of peer review, to look more broadly at the advice you were getting, for example, from your Building Regulations Division, about the clarity of the Building Regulations and Approved Document B?
Not at that stage, no, because we were so focused on what had gone on in the industry and what it might mean for what was still there and needed to be found and acted upon. So we were focused outwards rather than inwards at that stage.
Yeah. If we look over the page 7 at paragraph 19, you tell us you also asked for briefings on the building regulations themselves. Although I was not an expert, given the wording of Approved Document B, the building regulations and the 1984 Act, I thought it was fairly clear that combustible cladding systems that did not adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls and from one building to another were not permitted on tall residential buildings. Now, are those the briefings that you've already described to us?
Yes.
Was there anything else other than what you've just described in terms of briefings on the building regulations and the approved documents?
No, I don't think so. We also had legal advice on the building regulations, but no further briefings that I remember anyway.
And did you come away from those briefings with the impression that the guidance was clear or not?
Well, I was a layperson coming to this for the very first time. I was persuaded, including on the basis of the legal advice, that those approved documents didn't give grounds for anyone thinking that it was acceptable to put up ACM cladding on a tall residential building and be consistent with the building regulations. So that's what I've said in that second sentence, that I didn't think that cladding systems that did not adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls and from one building to another were permitted. I thought that much was clear from the reading of the documents. And as I said earlier, you would have to work extremely hard to be able to put together an argument that this was allowed. Yeah. But I was a layperson, and I was not forming a technical view. I was just looking at it, as a reasonably well-informed newcomer to the document.
Yeah. Picking that paragraph up again, 5 lines down, looking in the middle of the line, there's a line beginning, I also. You say, I also formed the view that the sincere belief of the department's building regulations and energy performance team was that the building regulations and the approved documents were already clear. The coroner's recommendation to revise approved document B following the Lakenhall House fire was interpreted by the department as a desire for plain English rather than a need for a fundamental clarification or change. Ministers had been advised accordingly in 2013. This fitted with the fact that the work on the approved document had not been raised with me during my first 2 years in the department. It was seen as a fairly narrow technical exercise. Yes. Now, you say you came to understand that the sincere belief of the department's team was that the approved documents were already clear. Was that what they told you themselves?
Yes. I mean, there's a lot going on in the second half of that paragraph. And, I did form that view that was their belief, that particular bit of the document, and in particular whether or not ACM cladding was permitted in order to meet the requirements of the building regulations, I did form the view that I thought it was reasonably clear enough perhaps, and that they did as well. However, I now know, and I suppose I knew a bit at the time, that they also knew that others didn't think it was clear. And, although in the end I believe that, the failure of the industry not to comply with this system was its own decision and its own accountability, the department's role in creating and overseeing and maintaining the documents that were supporting those activities was very clear, and clearly there were failures by the department on this. So I'm sorry I'm going on at some length here now, but I'm still of the view that they believed that these bits of the regulations were clear enough.
Did you hear any alternative views about why others had found the provisions to be so confusing?
Well, I was hearing and reading, because there was a lot of commentary in the media and people writing articles and so on all the time about the whys and wherefores of why it was confusing. But, at the same time, it wasn't easy to hear people from the industry going, oh, this was all the fault of the building regulations, when 72 people had died or were about to die, and it was quite clear that cladding should not have been on that building. So there was a resistance from the industry during those weeks as well, which was pretty hard to hear and to engage with. And so all discussions about the clarity of the building regulations were coloured a little bit like that. I think people were positioning themselves outside, and that may have, with hindsight, led to a certain resistance inside the department. But it wasn't a degree of resistance that I believe led us not to acknowledge that there were issues with these regulations that needed to be addressed. I think we did get quite quickly to the point that we could not go ahead with that consultation document, and that we needed to set up a much, much wider review of the whole system.
Yeah. Were you ever made aware that Brian Martin had been one of the authors of that particular part of Approved Document B? Were you aware of that when you were discussing it with him?
Yes, I think I probably was. I think I knew that he had written it, yes.
Right. Now, you tell us, if we can look at page 22 of this third statement, paragraph 52, that you tell us that you became aware, this is picking up in the middle of the first line, you became aware in the weeks after the Grenfell Tower fire that there was some confusion about the rules surrounding the national classification Class Naught. Now, how did you become aware of that?
Through people from the industry, including, as I was saying earlier, particularly Lord Porter, raising it really very frequently. Lord Porter raised it in Cobra meetings. He clearly felt very strongly that Class Naught and the confusion around Class Naught was one of the reasons why people might have thought it was acceptable to put ACM cladding on a building like that. Yeah.
Were you made aware that there was confusion between the concepts of National Class Naught and something called limited combustibility? Was that ever discussed with you?
Yes, in that meeting that I've described on the Tuesday after the fire, we did go into Class Naught and what it meant and limited combustibility. And I remember either then or maybe thereafter being taken through the different EU definitions of limited combustibility and what was covered by EU law and what was covered by UK law, because there's I think a fairly confusing table somewhere in the approved documents which attempts to map all of that and describe different types of cladding, and I remember engaging with that and being shown it.
Yes. Did Mr. Martin tell you that he was aware of confusion within the industry between the concept of National Class Naught and that of limited combustibility?
Yes, and we talked about that in the meeting.
When you say you talked about that, what was said about that confusion?
So, as I was describing earlier, what we did was go through the documents line by line, and I and Nick King put the challenge in the room, but some people are saying this, and how does that fit with this? And surely that isn't clear. And these, annexes you have to go to 2 or 3 annexes and then come back in. And it isn't very easy to use, is it? We were laying all those challenges in the room, albeit as lay people coming at it for the first time. And Brian was responding, I thought, pretty constructively and honestly about things, but he was also, making the points that needed to be made, actually in the end, which was that, albeit that maybe some of the bits of the document should have been more clearly drafted, they weren't a reason why you should put ACM cladding on a tall residential building. So I think that was always the background to this. But we did discuss those issues in some depth, yes.
Yeah. Did you take a look yourself at any stage at the coroner's recommendations that she made following the Lakanal inquest?
I read them, those recommendations and the coroner's letter a day or two after the fire, when I read the historic folder that Simon Ridley had looked at.
Yes.
Such as it was at the time, because it wasn't complete, but I read what we had.
Yes. Can we just look at those coroner's recommendations and the Rule 43 letter that she sent to the department? It's a CLG 401870. Now, the recommendations, so here we have it. It's 28th of March 2013 to the Right Honourable Eric Pickles MP. And it's on page 3 that we find the recommendations that were relevant to the building regulations in the approved document. And she tells us there, during these inquests, we examined approved document B. I'm aware that ADB has subsequently been amended and believe that a further amendment is due to be published soon. The introduction to ADB states that it is intended to provide guidance for some of the more common building situations. And then she says this, however, ADB is a most difficult document to use. Further, it is necessary to refer to additional documents in order to find an answer to relatively straightforward questions concerning the fire protection properties of materials to be incorporated into the fabric of a building. And then she says it's recommended that your department review ADB to ensure that it, and there's 3 points, first of all, provides clear guidance in relation to Regulation B4 of the building regulations, with particular regard to the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building and the circumstances in which attention should be paid to whether proposed work might reduce existing fire protection. 2 is expressed in words and adopts a format which are intelligible to the wide range of people and bodies engaged in construction, maintenance and refurbishment of buildings, and not just to professionals who may already have a depth of knowledge of building regulations and building control matters. And 3 provides guidance which is of assistance to those involved in maintenance or refurbishment of older housing stock, and not only those engaged in design and construction of new buildings. So can we agree that this Rule 43 letter specifically refers to the need to provide clear guidance regarding external fire spread?
Yes.
How had you come to understand that the coroner's recommendation was interpreted by the department as a desire for plain English rather than a need for a fundamental clarification or change?
Well, I think looking at this now, the department focused on the second bullet and intelligibility for a wider range of people, which they interpreted as plain English, and didn't pay enough attention to the first bullet, that ADB needed to provide clear guidance, and in particular with regard to the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building. And I don't know why that's the case. I think my understanding is, from what I've been told and also from what I've read, is that the department thought that there was a lot of confusion at the inquest about the various versions of the document, and that the improvements they had made subsequently had been overlooked a bit by the inquest. I think that's what they thought. But I am supposing what was in their minds now, because I wasn't there at the time. But I think those first 3 words in the first bullet, provides clear guidance, were not really fully internalised or heard, and the department went to a sort of clarification and simplification, perhaps because that was what they thought was needed, rather than anything more fundamental.
Yes. Did you come to appreciate that there was no proper record keeping relating to the Lackland inquest on the department's part, including no proper record of which recommendations had been accepted and which rejected?
Yes, I mean, I wasn't there at the time, but I'm not very aware of exactly what records were there at the time, but I've seen the submissions, and if that's all there is, then it's not a very detailed record, no.
I mean, that's all we've seen,
Yeah.
I think.
And I would just repeat what I said, this morning, which is that I also think that there was no tracking mechanism put in place for something that I think was extremely important and there should have been. And, because you've always going to have general elections, changes of ministers, that sort of disruption is normal in a civil service department. So you need systems to make sure that things get carried through and continue to get attention.
Yes. But as well as a tracking system, shouldn't there have been a very clear record within the department about what was accepted, what was rejected, and what work they knew they needed to do? I appreciate it's before your time, but that should have been there, shouldn't it?
Yes, I suspect the department thought at the time, in fact, I'm pretty sure I know they did, that the submissions were the record, and that advice to ministers on what should be done and what already had been done in response to some of the recommendations was sufficient.
Can you help us understand the procedure? Now, Miss Grange, if you're about to come to this, tell me.
No, carry on.
And I'll hold back. But I'm just curious to know how things work in the department when a letter is written to the Secretary of State. It's addressed to him personally, drops through the letterbox, it's opened presumably or by the post room or whatever. Is that how it works? And then what happens to it?
So it would find its way pretty sharpish to the private office.
To his private office?
His private office.
And is he at that point informed that it's come in?
Probably on something of this scale, yes.
Yeah.
Maybe not immediately that afternoon, but what I would expect to happen was that the private office would then action it, and they would make sure that it was clear who was the accountable director and deputy director that was going to take forward the work for something of this scale. If it was just correspondence from an MP, it might go straight into the team.
That could be
but this sort of thing would need a greater level of seniority, and I would expect that evening or the next day, certainly pretty soon, they would inform the Secretary of State that this has come in and that it's been actioned and that they'll get the response within
Show him the letter?
Yes, probably.
Shouldn't he see what...
Yes, he probably should, yes. Yeah, something like this, yes.
And does he take an interest in, as it were, where it goes for action or response?
Well, in my experience of working with Eric Pickles, he took a very keen interest in the details of how the department worked. He knew who all the directors were, and he made sure he talked to them regularly. And I suspect he would have wanted to know who this had all been actioned to, but he would also have expected his junior ministers to be overseeing this. He wouldn't expect this to come direct to him. I mean, something of this importance would need all of the ministerial team focused on it, with depending on their particular briefs and the particular areas of responsibility they had. And that is what happened, and I suspect that the former Secretary of State would have been very clear that it should have happened.
But eventually it does come back to him for a response, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So I would hope that he took some sort of interest in who was handling it and how they proposed to deal with it.
Yes, and I'm sure he did.
Right. Thank you very much.
Yes, now I want to look now at what was known about systemic failures across the construction industry and housing industry before Grenfell. And can we look at an email that Helen McNamara sends to you on the 20th of June 2017? It's at CAB 404662. And I'm looking at the second email down on the page. We can see it's there. It's to the Office of Melanie Dawes from Helen McNamara. And she says this. She says, Melanie, I promise to download my thoughts on the wider questions beyond immediate response. This is far from polished, but gives you a sense. And then she basically downloads to you a number of kind of thoughts she's got about the systems and system failure. And I want to pick it up at paragraph 3 and read 3, 4 and 5. She says at 3, if we go down the page, there could be a very, I think she means big bill. We are going to have a row about insufficient funding for councils to properly house vulnerable people. We know housing benefit doesn't pay for housing costs in large parts of the country. We will be knowingly devolved responsibilities to councils and cut funding, so can't argue that we expected the regulatory function to continue. RBKC chose a contractor that bid £6 million for a job when everyone else said £18 million. How much did we incentivise that? ? Then she goes on at 4. One of the messages that's come through loud and clear in the last week is that these 60s and 70s tower blocks are a real problem. I mentioned what I'd been told about electrical overload, given the number of people / phone charges in flats that were designed for 1970s living. We should argue for a proper programme of estate regeneration. And then at 5, she says, and on building standards, there's a risk that we end up narrowing the question too much. Yes, we probably have a problem with cladding, but we should be asking ourselves about building safety in general. One of the open secrets in the building industry is the inconsistent standards and tolerance of shoddy work. How much of a wider quality problem is there? ? Now, just a few questions about this. Just going back to paragraph 3, if we go back and look at that. Prior to the Grenfell Tower fire, were you aware of the view that there was insufficient funding to house vulnerable people, to properly house vulnerable people? Was that something that had hit your radar?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And were there initiatives in place to be dealing with that?
So we were really concerned about homelessness in particular, and also about the lack of availability of social housing, particularly in parts of the country where rents were very high, like London, which just meant that people had nowhere to live that they could afford with even quite averagely paid jobs. So we were very concerned about that. The government had some proposals to tackle that. They had a rough sleepers programme, but one of my real concerns in 2015 and 2016 was the wider homelessness problem, because local authorities were beginning to fail in their statutory duties to house people in the relevant time periods.
And do you think that's what she's referring to there in this paragraph?
Yes, probably.
Now, also at paragraph 3, she says at the end of that paragraph, RBKC chose a contractor that bid £6 million for a job when everyone else said £18 million. How much did we incentivise that? Now, how might you have been incentivising that? What was she meaning by that?
Yes, my apologies. I haven't seen this email for 5 years nearly, so I'm just digesting it a bit. So reading that whole paragraph, she's talking about the cuts to local council funding, which will have affected their ability to carry out their regulatory functions, and that could have led people to cut corners. I think that's probably part of what she was referring to. I mean, just the wider cuts to councils, I think, is mainly what she's saying in this paragraph, and how everyone was, how the budgets for housing were very tight indeed. And, you know, the department did actually have estate regeneration programmes already at this point, although they were mostly based on loan funding rather than investment funding, and we knew that they were therefore going to have a fairly limited impact.
Right. And then looking at paragraph 4, the beginning of that, had it come to your attention prior to this fire that 1960s and 70s tower blocks had become a real problem? And what do you think she meant by that?
I don't think that I had it on my radar, or that people had expressed it as a real problem in the sense of a sort of systemic problem or a very wide-scale problem. But we were very aware that there were a lot of 60s and 70s blocks that were coming to the end of their lives or needed very significant refurbishment, and this was extremely expensive and just simply couldn't be afforded within councils' normal budgets, particularly in cities where the costs are so high. And that there were some parts of London, such as Elephant and Castle, where the regeneration could take place on a commercial balance sheet. But for the most part, that was not going to be remotely possible. And it was going to need government funding, central government funding, grant funding, and not loan funding or equity loans or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I was certainly aware of that. And I went and visited quite a lot of those sites, quite early on in my time as Permanent Secretary. It was one of the big issues we had on our radar. But we were also very concerned just about general funding for any form of social housing investment, which had been stopped in the first year of the government following 2015, although it was reinstated later when Gavin Barwell and Sajid Javid did their housing work in 2016. But we were worried about that as well, because that was just simply to keep house building going in the social sector. And then we were also worried about homelessness, which was more about revenue funding. It was more about benefit payments for individuals to cover their costs.
Right.
So
And
there were layers of problems on the funding side.
Yeah. Looking at paragraph 5 then over the page, were you aware of this open secret that she refers to in the third line of paragraph 5 in the building industry, being the inconsistent standards and tolerance of shoddy work? Were you aware of that?
Yes, I think I was. And I can't quite remember when it was, whether it was before the fire or not, but there were quite a lot of issues about just small homes being built in the private sector at the time, and problems with the sewage failing and guarantees not really working and so on. So we were certainly aware that there were shoddy standards, yes.
Were you aware of inconsistent standards and tolerance of shoddy work by building control authorities before the Grenfell Tower fire?
Well, I can't remember when these issues began to come to my attention, but there were a lot of articles in the press about some of this at a certain point, and I just can't remember quite when, and whether it was before or after. I instinctively think it was very shortly before that those stories were being told, and I remember a particular development and a very sort of household name builder, one of the big name builders, I can't remember which one now, coming forward and taking responsibility and saying they were having to address some issues, and they apologised and so on to the residents. So there was a story, it was addressed by the developer, but it clearly raised questions as to how it got signed off by building control, and that was the part of the problem as well. And I recall all of those issues being aired and discussed.
But do you remember having meetings with the Building Regulations Division about that, or with the Building Control Department about that? Because I think there was a separate department.
I don't remember having meetings with the team. I remember it being a discussion with my own team,
right.
And possibly with some of the directors involved. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think that's a good moment for our afternoon break, if that's okay.
Yes. Just give us all a bit of encouragement. How are you getting on?
No, I'm getting on fine for time. But perhaps if we could start again at 25 to.
That's possibly a bit tight.
Go on then, 22. That's fine. I'll make it work.
But anyway, you're on course to.
Yes, I'm on course to finish today. We may go slightly after
that's
4:30
what,
with the final questions, but we will
Yeah,
finish
of course.
today.
No, we might have to overrun slightly, but I think some reassurance that we're on course to finish today is probably welcome. Yes. Anyway, we'll have a break now. We'll come back, please, at 20 to 4. And again, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone who are out of the room. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. 20 to 4, please. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Melanie to come back in, please? Right, ready to carry on?
Yes.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Gray.
Yes, thank you. Yes, before we broke off, we were on the topic of what was known by the department about systemic failings within the building and housing industry. Can we look at another email, please? It's CLG 403996. Now, this is an email that was sent to Jeremy Hayward. You can see that at the top of the page on the 25th of June 2017 by you. We see your name in the box at the top. So it's sent to Jeremy Hayward and others within the Cabinet Office. Subject Grenfell inquiries, commissions, investigations, etc. And you say, Jeremy, as we discussed, I'd be very keen to have a meeting tomorrow. And in the next paragraph, you say it's quite clear, particularly in the light of the 100% test failure, that there are systemic issues to address across the whole system of fire and building safety regulations, from the framework itself through to the behaviour of the construction industry across the supply chain, the way local authorities / RSLs commission and manage building work, the way fire and building inspections work, and possibly the role and voice of tenants. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, did RSL stand for Registered Social Landlords?
Yes.
And just help us, Jeremy Hayward, what was his role within the Cabinet Office at this point?
He was the Cabinet Secretary
Yes.
and head of the Home Civil Service.
Yes. Now, did you discuss with others in your department how it had allowed these problems to remain unaddressed, particularly following the Lakanor House fire and inquest? Did you have that discussion with them?
Yes, I had the conversation with Helen McNamara, Tamara Finkelstein, who was by then leading the building safety programme, with directors, including Sally Randall and others. It was a very active conversation in the weeks leading up to the launch of the Hackitt Review in particular.
And just in short form, what conclusions did you reach about the reasons the department had allowed such problems to persist for so long, going unaddressed? Can you just summarise what you felt the reasons were?
At the time, what I thought, I was my main concern was to name the issues and get a proper urgent review of them, rather than to try to ask the whys and wherefores of why we'd got to where we'd got to. What I think now is that there was a failure of overall system oversight by the department over many decades. I think I must have thought that at the time as well. I had read by this point, a lot of the historic documents, and I'd concluded that the department had failed to respond to an awful lot of warning signals right back to the 1999 Select Committee, through to responses to various files along the way. And I didn't know at the time some of the things that you were asking me about earlier this afternoon that the team knew.
Yes.
So, but above all, I knew by this point that the construction industry had failed to follow the building regulations.
Yes.
In quite a major way.
Yes. Did you conclude that the department's deregulatory agenda had had any impact in allowing these matters to go unaddressed for so long?
I'm sure that was in my mind at the time, but it wasn't really what I was trying to achieve at this point. I was trying to get this review set up, and we had to argue for this pretty seriously.
Yeah.
So I sent this email on the Sunday, and we followed it up. Helen and Tamara and I went to a meeting at the Cabinet Office, and the Cabinet Office and Number 10 were not at all keen to set up the Hackitt Review, and we had, to be honest, one of the toughest arguments I remember ever having with Jeremy Hayward about it. They felt that the public inquiry would be able to cover these issues, but we thought it was too urgent for that, with the greatest of respect to what the inquiry is seeking to achieve.
Yeah, yeah. We can see that after the Grenfell Tower fire, your office requested a copy of the BRE 7 workstream reports, the research reports that had been done by the BRE, and I think had been commissioned, in fact, before the coroner's recommendations following the Lakanor fire. If we just look at CLG 406269, It's an email dated the 22nd of June 2017. There we have it. It says the subject is fire compartmentation reports completed for publication 2015. And it says, as requested, it probably refers to these reports from BRE, and we believe you were sent those reports. Do you remember ever reading those 7 workstream reports?
I can't recall whether I did or not.
Do you remember ever appreciating that they raised wide-ranging and fundamental issues, particularly regarding fire spread and means of escape for the disabled?
I can't recall reading them, so I can't say that I was aware that they included those points, no.
So you can't help us as to whether there had been a deliberate desire not to proceed with the review of ADB and to sit on these reports, perhaps because they showed how fundamentally flawed the guidance was that had been put out already?
No, I can't really help with that, but it's never been my impression that the department deliberately sat on reports and delayed the work in order to prevent difficult things from getting out. That's never been my impression. My impression is that the delays, of which there are many, were the result of poor work, poor project management, difficulties in getting work progressed.
Did you ever get the impression that the delays might have been caused because the work was seen as simply too difficult? Too complex, too hard, they were too far behind the curve, there was too much to do. Did you ever get that impression?
So I wasn't aware of the work at the time, of course, so I can't give you any impression of what it was like for them prior to the Grenfell Tower fire, but it wouldn't surprise me if, given the situation that they were in and how far behind they were and how difficult it was, genuinely, particularly when you put alongside that the knowledge that they had about what was going on out there in the industry and the risks that were being taken, it wouldn't surprise me if it was overwhelming and almost impossible to put one foot in front of the other for some or all of the team members at different points, yes.
Yes. Now, we know that, or you tell us in your witness statement that you convened a panel of experts after the fire, and on the 18th of June, a letter was sent in your name to all housing providers giving guidance on what to do if they were concerned about their cladding on their buildings. Let's just briefly look at that letter. That's at CLG 403534. Here's the letter, 18th of June. It goes to local authority chief executives and housing association chief executives. And it provides guidance on what to do and public concern. And you can see in paragraph 2, the second paragraph, that it's referring to the particular type of cladding, aluminium composite material, etc. Now, can you remember who drafted this letter to housing providers?
No, I can't remember who drafted it, but at the time I was aware it was being drafted, and I took the decision that I wasn't going to oversee it myself. It was going to be signed off by others because there were so many people who wanted to have a look at it, including all the various ministers involved, and I was confident that I could delegate this to, I believe, Helen McNamara and probably Neil O'Connor as the Director General and Director who were right in the middle of all of this on that Sunday.
Yeah. And who was providing the technical advice about the ACM panels at this point? Was that the Building Regulations Division?
Yes, but there had been a meeting, which I didn't convene myself, but it was convened by the department on the Saturday morning, of experts to talk about these issues. And I recall that was about what sorts of tests should be done, what were the issues that should be looked for, etc.
Yeah.
And so that advice was also feeding into the guidance that was attached. So I was aware of that overall process, what was going on, and the conversations that were being had.
Yeah. Now, shortly after this, there was another letter sent out in your name. If we can go to that, RBK 30015952. Here we've got another letter, 22nd of June, so just a few days later, headed again to local authority chief executives and housing association chief executives about safety checks following the Grenfell Tower fire. And if we look at Annex A to the letter, which begins on page 2, we can see that it states in the first paragraph, if it is determined that the insulation within aluminium composite material, and then there's a footnote, which we'll go to in a moment, is unlikely to be compliant with the requirements of the current building regulations guidance, it is essential that you immediately implement the following interim mitigating measures to ensure the safety of residents pending replacement of the cladding. And then if we look at the foot of that page to footnote 1, we can see the footnote reads this: for the avoidance of doubt, the core, and then in parentheses, filler, within an aluminium composite material, ACM, is an insulation material / product, insulation product and or filler material, as referred to in paragraph 12.7, insulation material / products in section 12, construction of external walls of approved document B, fire safety, volume 2, buildings other than dwelling houses. The important point to note is that paragraph 12.7 does not just apply to thermal insulation within the wall construction, but applies to any element of the cladding system, including, therefore, the core of the ACM. Now, when this letter went out in your name, did you understand that that was a new position being taken by the department? Or was that a reflection of the position it had always taken?
I don't particularly recall this letter. There were quite a lot of letters going out, and I was comfortable for them to go out in my name. It was clear that the permanent secretary needed to send them in order for them to get the right priority, but I wasn't checking every single bit of drafting. So my understanding of this now and at the time is that this is the department attempting to clarify that bit of the document that we were discussing earlier. Yes. Paragraph 12.7.
Yes. And
to make it absolutely clear that filler, that you know, particularly that last sentence in brackets, that paragraph 12.7 doesn't just apply to thermal insulation, but it applies to any element of the cladding system, including, therefore, the core of the ACM.
Yeah.
And so it's the department attempting to clarify what it knew had been disputed. And I suspect that was because people were saying, we don't know what you mean, you know, the regulations aren't clear. And so this was an attempt to clarify that.
Yes. Did you appreciate that the department hadn't previously made this interpretation publicly known in any guidance, FAQ, response or circular letter? Did you realise that at the time when this was going out?
No, I didn't, but this description is what I understood to be the department's position before the Grenfell Tower fire, even if they hadn't communicated it at this level of detail. I thought this was what the department believed to be the case. Yes.
And had it been explained to you, you said that it was meant to intend that all elements of the system had to be of limited combustibility. Had that been explained to you that that was the intention of clause 12.7?
Well, there were some exemptions, weren't there, in paragraph 12.7? Is that correct? There are sealers and gaskets and so on.
It says excluding sealers
excluding
and gaskets.
Those. Yeah. So I don't know whether that applies to any element is removing those exclusions or not. I'm not sure. So that looks like it might be a change if that was the case.
Yeah.
But I didn't particularly look at this at the time. I was trusting others to be preparing this kind of technical material, you know, on behalf of the department. We were managing an enormous amount of work, so I was relying on others to take care of this.
Yes.
And by this stage, we had Tamara Finkelstein, Neil O'Connor and others, you know, heavily engaged. Simon Gallagher had taken over the oversight of the building regulations work specifically and what to do with the approved documents. So I knew that we were relying on quite a large number of extremely able directors.
Yeah. Did you think that sprang naturally and obviously from the parts of the approved document that you'd by now studied line by line?
I can't comment on what I did think at the time because I don't recall particularly dwelling on the footnote. I'm sure somebody would have told me that we were trying to clarify it, and I would have thought that was a good thing. What I didn't seek to do, despite having gone through the document in some detail, was to line by line check this footnote and make sure that it wasn't in some way going beyond what we should do in any way. So I don't really remember dwelling on this, basically.
Okay. Were you aware that it had been suggested, including at a meeting in July 2014 that Mr. Martin attended, that the lack of clarity within 12.7 could be addressed, at least in the shorter term, by an FAQ, a frequently asked question, being published on the department's website? Were you made aware of that?
No, I wasn't made aware of that.
When was the first time you were aware that this FAQ route had been raised with the department many years before the Grenfell Tower fire?
I'm not sure that I was aware of the FAQ route.
Right. Can we look at another email now? CLG 409421. This is an email chain dated the 19th of June 2017. If we start with the email at the bottom of the page, it's from Sophie Broadfield to Simon Gallagher on the 19th of June 2017, copying in Helen McNamara and the Grenfell Tower team for action building regulations consultation. Now, just help us, who was Sophie Broadfield?
Sophie Broadfield was one of our deputy directors who had been moved across after the fire to one of the coordination roles that we established.
Okay. And Simon Gallagher?
Simon was the director of planning policy.
Yes. Now, we can see from the first paragraph, she says, Simon, apologies if you've already received this message from another route. In discussion with Melanie and Helen today, it was suggested that you might urgently take forward a work stream following on from the Grenfell Tower fire. Can you please let, and there's an email address, I think it means no, who will lead this work if you're happy to pick it up? And then she goes on, specifically, it was agreed that someone needs to pull together the work relating to the building regulations consultation that was due to be published, as I understand it, this summer. So that's what Sophie Broadfield was asking Simon Gallagher. And then if we look at the response to this email at the top of page 1, we can see there's a response from Steve Quartermain to Helen McNamara, just between those two. And Mr. Quartermain says this, not sure what's going on here. As director, I already led on this piece of work and have everything under control. I have a sub ready, a revamped one from the March edition, and I've already spoken to Alok about it. This was on my list to raise tomorrow at the next catch-up. WE stand ready to publish something by July 20th, if ministers agree. In terms of the building reg response to the Grenfell Tower event, we are absolutely on top of it. We've sorted the labs, we've sorted the tests, we've written to the social landlords. We are putting in place resources to not only deal with the technical issues, but also the business as usual work. It was only after my appointment as director in charge of the Building Regulations and Energy Performance Division that I recognised the delay in this area, and I can evidence how I got a grip and pushed this forward. I even had a one-to-one with Gavin to tell him to pay more attention to the building regulations and energy performance subs. I am concerned this is another example of Melanie undermining my position. I'm sorry to say this, but I have discussed this with you in the past. I've kept a record of previous examples. I do not want to pursue this through some sort of grievance procedure, as Lord knows we have enough on. But as one of you, SCS, a male, I do feel that the work I do is not being appreciated and I'm being discriminated against. I can see no grounds to suggest that Simon takes this on. I should be judged on what I achieve, not whether I move my laptop onto the 4th floor. I suggest we discuss first thing in the morning. So it's a fairly strong response from Mr. Quartermain. Now, have you ever seen this email before?
Yes, I have. I didn't see it at the time, but I saw it because the inquiry asked me about it in the list of questions you sent me.
Can you explain, sorry, had you seen it before that, before
No,
it was in your Royal
I
Mind
hadn't.
request? So Helen McNamara hadn't discussed it with you at the time?
No.
Can you explain why you wanted Simon Gallagher to take forward the work on the building regulations consultation at this time and not Steve Quartermain's team?
Yes, well, there were a number of reasons for that. And, you know, should perhaps just, if I can explain a little bit, that we'd changed the structure in 2016 because previously Steve Quartermain's role as Chief Planner was graded at Deputy Director and reported into the Director for Planning. But in the autumn of 2015 and through to the spring of 2016, Steve went to run the planning inspectorate for us, which was incredibly good of him because it was really, really challenging because it was in Bristol and he lived in London and so on. And when he came back from that, because it was for a temporary period and then we made a permanent appointment, I decided to promote him, make him a director, to acknowledge really his seniority and, you know, also partly as a thank you for what he'd gone through, and he had a few more years to retirement. And so it was at that point that he became a director sitting alongside Simon Gallagher, who would otherwise have been his line manager. Simon was actually quite new in post, so he hadn't previously been Steve's line manager. And they worked together and worked very closely together. And Simon was a more general policy official, capable at picking up a brief and working through it, and by then quite experienced on planning. Steve was a fully qualified planning professional and was head of, you know, the national planning system.
So why did you want Simon Gallagher to take forward this work rather than Steve Quartermain?
So my apologies for giving you the background, but what we were faced with was, you know, a huge amount of additional work kicking off across the department, and I moved a lot of directors around over that weekend. And Steve was the chief planner, and nobody else could do the job that he did as chief planner. We couldn't move him off that because there was no one else to do it. And it's a really big and important role, and you know, if you mess up your planning decisions, then you end up in all sorts of trouble. So I didn't think, and I'm not even sure I made this decision, I think it was in Helen's area, and I think it was her call, didn't think that Steve had the capacity to pick up this huge burning set of issues on the building regs alongside his existing role. And so Simon was already closely related to that, and we asked him to step in.
Right.
And I had no idea Steve was so cross about it, or indeed about the wider issues he raises either, which obviously was very disappointed to read about.
Did you also want more objectivity in that review? So you said it was about
that was part of it, although we didn't sort of particularly doubt Steve's judgment, but he wasn't an expert in the building regulations area. He'd only picked it up the previous year.
Yes.
If I'm honest, I think this email does show that, and I said this in my witness statement, I don't think we were absolutely on top of it, because although we had done the things that Steve mentions, what we weren't really doing and needed to do was to stop and actually pause and think about all the issues around the building regulations that we've been discussing, about the clarity of the document, etc. And it wasn't going to be appropriate to just publish where we'd got to before the fire. No. And so I think it was the right thing to put Simon on to that, and you know, I think there's much more I can say, really.
Is it fair to say, therefore, that you did have some concerns about failings on the part of Mr. Quartermain and his department below him in dealing with the building regulations, and that was part of why you wanted Mr. Gallagher to come in as someone more objective?
It was certainly going to be good to get a fresh pair of eyes on this, we thought, but I was, you know, being really clear not to kind of assign blame or start to have any kind of witch hunt in the department about who had failed. I thought that would be extremely counterproductive at this stage and quite unfair. Okay. And in particular, Steve had only been doing this for a year, and it had clearly, the failures had been going on a lot longer than that.
No, fair. But help me with this. Was this response of Mr. Quartermain typical of that part of your department? Was that department, looking back on it, defensive about the work that it was doing, resistant to other people's suggestions? Is that something that was a problem?
Well, I didn't know the BREC team particularly, as I was saying earlier. I don't think I met the members of the team until after the fire. So I can't really say for sure, but I think, you know, as technical professionals, and I think some of this probably applied to Steve himself as a planner as well, they may have felt, you know, undervalued in the department, and you know, that can then lead to a certain defensiveness. So I'm not sure that Steve's email particularly tells us anything about the BREP team. I think they were somewhat different, and they'd only recently started working within Steve's overall area. But perhaps there is something about what happens in a government department which has, technical professionals who have spent their careers on certain issues, and how sometimes they can feel in a department that's trying to get things done for the government of the day.
Yes. Now, my final topic that I want to come on to relates in more detail to some of the evidence we've heard from Richard Harrell and Bob Leadsom, who've given evidence to the inquiry in the last 2 weeks. And I want to ask you some questions about a number of matters arising from their evidence, given your role as head of that department. Mm-hmm. Now, both gentlemen spoke candidly about a number of failings within the department, and I want to ask you what you knew about this, what you did about it if you did know, or if you didn't know, whether you should have been made aware of these issues. Now, we probably need to keep your answers a little bit shorter going into this final section, because otherwise we won't finish today, and I'm keen for that to happen. Now, first of all, lack of resources and problems with recruitment. Now, we've touched on some of these issues already, but were you aware that the Building Regulations Division had been experiencing acute problems with the recruitment of senior professional technical officers, such that the roles had been phased out over time? Was that something that came to your attention?
No, I was not aware of that. I was aware of the general resourcing challenges for the department, and that we were going to have to make further cuts, but not the specific pressures on those teams.
Right. Did you know that the department was struggling to recruit people with the right skill sets and depth and breadth of knowledge at the salary levels being offered?
No, that wasn't brought to my attention.
Were you ever informed about recruitment problems within the Building Regulations Division?
No.
If there were such problems, should, if not you, but more senior personnel have been informed that they were struggling to recruit people with the right skills at the right levels and with the salary levels being offered? Should that have been escalated?
Yeah, so let me just give you a slightly longer answer here. What I tried to do was to invest a lot in much more strategic workforce planning when I arrived in the department. And we had good HR teams, actually, but the department had been very static for a number of years. There'd been big cuts. Hardly anyone had then left, and there'd been very few vacancies. And so what I sought to do was to lift our eyes a little bit to what we needed. And that included making sure that we had succession plans in place for our more technical areas. I wasn't aware of this one specifically, but I was aware of some others, including local government finance, which has a lot of the same issues. Yeah. Very hard to get people. They don't feel valued in the department, although I think it's probably slightly easier on local government finance. But things like local government pensions, planning, also commercial skills. So I did instigate quite a lot of new work in that area, and this sort of problem should have then formed part of that. Yeah. But I suspect all that came a bit later on, right, more in 2016, 2017. So by the time of the fire, it wouldn't have had an impact on the teams, and I wasn't aware of their specific issues at the time.
Yeah, so that was just that piece of work was just really too late for this department.
Yes.
Were you aware that the Building Regulations Division was working on a less than bare bones capacity? That's how Mr. Harrell explained it to us.
Well, I wasn't aware of their specific pressures, but I knew that the department was really tight on resources, and that was true everywhere. And we had to take another 25% cut to our overall admin budget in the spending review in 2015, and that was on top of a 40% cut in the previous Parliament. And there wasn't really a plan for that. The Treasury, did it to everybody, and we were quite lucky that we didn't get 40%, which some did, because we'd had it before. And that's why I did the business planning exercise in that winter, to make sure that we could flush out where there were real pressures, and that's where those pressures should have come through. So again, I'm confident that there were systems and processes in place for these things to be raised, and I'm sure it was quite challenging. But this team were not cut as much as the overall departmental average, in fact, over this period. I think Mr. Leadsom mentioned that in his witness statement, and he's correct.
Were you aware that resources were so stretched that there was no proper record keeping, no filing system or index used by the Building Regulation Division, for example, to keep pace of changes to the approved documents which were being suggested by industry? Although Mr. Harrell accepted that would be a good thing, he said there was just no time to do anything like that. Did you have any awareness that they were so stretched and that their record keeping therefore was so poor?
No, I wasn't aware of that at the time, no.
Was that a matter, in your experience, which was replicated across the whole department, or do you think now it was peculiar to this Building Regulations Division?
I don't think it was replicated across the whole department, no. We had a lot of discussions in the summer of 2015. We knew we were going to have to take more cuts. And, I discussed this at length with my directors and my senior team. How were we going to manage and what were the issues? And the view of pretty much all my directors was that because the department had been so static for quite a while, we had quite a lot of people for whom, to be honest, it was time for them to move on. And we had quite a lot of people who just lost their motivation and where performance was becoming quite an issue. And that if we could actually manage a dignified exit scheme, then that would actually release some of the pressures in teams because it would improve the overall quality of what we were able to do. And that, despite being a cut in resources, would actually help us. And so that's what we did. We 200 people left the department by the spring of 2016 under a voluntary exit programme that we ran that was quite heavily based on performance issues. It included a number of members of the senior civil service, and that allowed us to backfill some of those posts and continue in tandem with the business planning exercise. And that's where we were in 2016 at the time of the Brexit referendum. So that was the overview, and that conversation was certainly a tough one. It was really tough. And at times we had to have recruitment freezes and so on. But I wasn't aware that the pressures were such that the basic functions of teams were not being carried out in the way that you've described.
Yes, because, according to Richard Harrell, the situation in this building regulations division was so bad that the department actually didn't have the ability or the capacity to fulfil what they needed to do under the statutory scheme, i.e. to issue practical guidance that was fit for purpose. They were so deficient that they couldn't do that. They couldn't fulfil those basic functions. Now, whose responsibility was it to flag that to people more senior so that maybe you or those around you were aware?
I would have expected all that to come up through the business planning process in the early months of 2016 and to come up via Bob to Sally Randall as the director and to be put into our thinking.
Yeah.
Because we did have the capacity to make adjustments. I set up some new teams, for example, to oversee local government finance at a system level because I was really worried about that.
Yeah.
So we did have flexibility.
Yeah,
some.
so was that for Bob Leadsom as the deputy director to be escalating that to more senior?
Well, yes, he would have been the one who was responsible overall for understanding the resourcing pressures in his team.
Yeah. Richard Harrod also told us that the building regulation system had become completely outmoded and outpaced by industry. Did you have any awareness of that?
Not at the time, no.
And again, was that Mr. Leadsom's responsibility that he ought to have made sure that if people felt that way, it was escalated up?
Yes, I would have expected that sort of thinking to be reflected in the submissions about what to do about the building regulations. And it's the sort of thing that would have resonated, I think, with ministers because they would have understood that technology was moving a lot. They would have understood the modern methods of construction, issues that I was talking about this morning. They would have got that, and I think it would have persuaded them that a more fundamental review was, actually justified and potentially quite exciting given the scale of change that it would have been trying to address.
Now, we know that Brian Martin was the technical policy lead on fire safety in the department. And we also know now that pretty much anything relating to fire safety would go to him during the time he was fire safety policy lead, which was for a very long time. And that effectively, we also know there was no one in the department who was able to challenge him on fire safety matters. Now, if those things are all right, that was consistent with the fact that the technical policy leads had always had a very large degree of autonomy in the department. Now, were you aware of that when you were permanent secretary?
I wasn't aware of that specific team and of Brian's specific role, as I've explained earlier today, but I was certainly aware that in the department generally we had some extremely small pockets of resource, expertise that were in one or two people, and that was a risk for us as a department, and that was one of the reasons why I set in place the strategic workforce planning that I was describing earlier, because even if it was right to only have one or two people, you then had to have succession plans, and you had to think really clearly about where you might be drawing on resource and support from outside, because you can manage these things with quite small teams inside a government department, as long as you know where you're going for the additional technical advice, whether that was BRAC or the BRE or wherever.
Yeah. Do you agree with this, that having a single person within the department who was regarded as technically competent and who was unassailable was positively dangerous, especially if that person effectively had ownership of the relevant guidance documents regarding it? I mean, he said in his own words that he regarded it as his third child. Can we agree, looking back now, that that was a pretty dangerous thing to have, as just this all falling on one man's shoulders?
Yes, I do. I think it's a single point of failure that had been allowed to be created.
Can you explain how such an important life safety policy area ended up solely within the purview of one grade 7 officer? Can you explain how that could happen?
Well, I think it reflects a lot of the things we've been talking about. I'll try to be brief, but it reflects first the lack of appreciation by the department that there was a system oversight role to play, let alone that it was accountable for playing that role. I think added to that, you had the red tape challenge, which meant that regulation was not seen as something valuable. It was seen as something that created costs and burdens. You then add to that the very strong localism agenda, which meant that the department was, positively discouraged in a number of areas from finding out facts about how local government was doing in delivering services in a way that it would previously have gathered information before, and the demise of the Audit Commission was part of that. And I think alongside that, you then have the cuts, which meant that some teams became under-resourced. This wasn't the only one where those were issues. So I think when you put all that together, I can see how the conditions were in place for the team's life to be made really quite difficult. And I would say above all, because actually what was obviously becoming evident through those years was that the system was failing. They were spotting signs of that, but there was nobody to talk to about it. And that must have been extremely difficult and extremely stressful for them, whether it was conscious in their minds or not.
But one of the things that might be said is that Mr. Martin was, in fact, receiving a huge amount of important information. He was going to important meetings, he was getting the right feedback, but it was going nowhere. It wasn't being communicated. And we went through with Mr. Leadsom and Mr. Harrell whether they knew about some of the things Mr. Martin had been told, and they simply didn't know. Now, can you account for how that can happen, that you get this pocket of a person with a life safety portfolio who is effectively not being properly challenged, monitored? People don't realise that they are in possession of warnings that should be being escalated. Can you explain how that can come about?
I mean, only really as a team that wasn't functioning properly and collaborating within itself. And yes, there were not very many resources, but you can find ways around that by explicitly putting in place systems to have updates and share things with each other, by, as I was saying earlier, talking to people outside. You can, to some extent, systems and processes can counter the fact that you haven't got people who are doing all the work all the time inside the department. And I would have expected that to be some of what was being discussed, by Bob with his team members, and also actually for the directors to be checking that those sorts of systems and conversations were in place.
Yes. I mean, can you explain how the department found itself to be completely unequipped to deal with serious public safety issues being raised with it? For example, in July 2014, it was warned about the use of combustible insulation on high-rise buildings, including failures in building control, which had led to that situation occurring. Now, Mr. Harrell and Mr. Leadsom did know about that, but they've admitted, well, certainly Mr. Harrell has admitted, that the department, they were completely unequipped to deal with those warnings. Yep. Again, can you explain how that can have come about?
I can only really just refer back to what I've just said, but can I just add one additional point?
Yes.
The other thing that was going on at the time was that many people, ministers, Bob Kerslake as Permanent Secretary and also as head of the Homes and Communities Agency, Peter Schofield as the Director General, will have been out there in the industry all the time, finding out what was going on and talking to people. And this was not, as far as I can tell, a conversation that was being had by people in the industry who were chief executives or heads of development in the major companies. So I think there was a separation in the industry as well between those who were dealing with the technical issues and those who were running the companies, and that juxtaposition I find quite weird and difficult to explain as well, because the signals weren't, as far as I can tell, coming in via Bob and Peter or anyone else from the conversations they were having, and they were having very extensive conversations all the time.
Yes. When these serious public safety issues were raised with the Building Regulations Division, there appears to have been no attempt, talking about this specific one in July 14 with combustible insulation, no attempt to contact the manufacturer of the combustible insulation, no attempt to contact all of the relevant building control bodies involved, including the local authority building control, no attempt to contact Advertising Standards Authority or trading standards. Now, can you help us as to how that state of affairs could have come about? I appreciate it didn't regard itself as a regulator or even think about the fact it might have any kind of regulatory responsibility, but how does it not even put up red flags to organisations that clearly need to know about these problems?
Well, I mean, clearly the team just wasn't at some level able to cope with that information and know what to do with it. And I think, I can't judge it myself, whose fault that was. I wasn't aware of the issues at the time. And you're talking, in fact, on this one about things that happened before I arrived in the department. But I can't say any more, I think, than I already have about some of the issues that I think made it very difficult for the team. But in the end, I can't explain why they made certain decisions.
Yes. Mr. Harrell said they'd become very siloed in their thinking and non-reactive because, in his words, doing anything was hard. Do you recognise that as a problem within at least some quarters of the department during your time there?
Well, it does feel to me like there was... The team, particularly perhaps Mr. Harrell, were under a huge amount of stress. And I mentioned earlier that I thought the department was, one of the most, well, definitely the most collaborative and supportive environments I worked in, and actually had an awful lot of support on offer for people suffering from mental health problems or stresses and strains. And for me, some of what was going on in the team ought to have been considered a welfare issue, actually, and taken through a route that would have provided support for some of the individuals in the team. And in my experience, the department was better at that than pretty much any other I've ever worked in, particularly in those days. So, that's the other thing I think should have happened, is some sense of understanding how everybody was feeling, particularly perhaps Richard
Yes.
Harrell, who's described that very clearly.
Yes. That sense of frustration they felt, they felt that they were a low priority in the department and they were always at the back of the queue. At the back of the queue for ministerial briefings, at the back of the queue in terms of ministerial time and priorities. Did you appreciate at the time, if you'd been asked, that division was at the back of the queue? Would you have known that?
I wouldn't describe it as a queue. I really wouldn't. I would say that it was, when you work in areas like that are technical, and are not particularly of interest to ministers, but are necessary, then the benefit you have is that you get to run your own show a bit more, and you don't have to cope with some of the challenges that other civil servants face of working in more ministerially central areas where it's really hard to get work done and you're constantly working with other departments and so on. You have a different set of pressures on you. So I think there are swings and roundabouts here, and they weren't back of the queue in the sense of resourcing, because they were not cut by as much as some of the other teams in the department. They were never going to be the first team that met a brand new minister arriving. That was just a fact. But it didn't mean that they were somehow, less important than others. They just, they were trusted to get on with their work and able to get on with their work to a greater extent than some others, although that's clearly not how it felt to them at the time.
I mean, Mr. Harrell said in his evidence that his engagement with director-level civil servants was sporadic because they were so busy. Were you aware of that they were just not getting the access they needed to director-level because
I was certainly
everyone
very
was so
aware.
busy?
Oh, my apologies. I was certainly very aware that my directors were very stretched. I mean, Sally Randall's portfolio was huge, and she was the lead person on the Housing and Planning Act and the pretty difficult policies we were thinking through on the voluntary right to buy, the sale of local authority social housing, pay to stay, and so on, homelessness, rough sleeping. So my directors were busy. Yes, they were, and they needed their deputy directors and their teams to be getting on with the work, and I think this team was trusted to do that. And I guess what I would have expected is a proper two-way conversation, particularly between Bob and Sally, less so perhaps between the team members and Sally, so that those pressures were fully understood. Yeah.
Can we agree that there were failings both at deputy director level and higher than that? Because higher than that, they should have been making sure they were aware that these people felt that they were at the back of the queue and shouldn't have let them be at the back of the queue and should have at times made sure they were prioritised more. Can we agree that?
Yes, I think we can. I don't think we can say that this is just the fault of the team in any way, no.
Yes. And in terms of anxiety and frustration, were you ever made aware that the sense of anxiety and frustration was actually making people ill? Was that ever brought to your attention?
I wasn't aware of that, no.
Now, we talked about the fact there was no system for tracking coroner's recommendations, and you've said that was a failing. Can you help us as to why there was no such system? Isn't that a very obvious thing that anybody should have made sure was in place, whether you, your predecessor? How did that failing come about? Can you help us with that?
Well, I've not come across such a system in any department I've worked in. I mean, there may have been systems, but I wasn't aware of them. So I don't think this is routine. It's something that's done for Public Accounts Committee recommendations because the Treasury coordinates it and they write a Treasury minute every quarter or so on behalf of the whole of government. So there's a Whitehall-wide process. But there are very few rules across the civil service or even best practice on how this sort of system and process management should be done and what sorts of things should be in place. And I think this is a gap. I think to some extent the civil service over the last couple of decades has lost some of its historic understanding of how you put in place some of these systems. And I do believe that this was not about this department being uniquely unable to track that kind of thing. I really don't believe that. I think that this is something that could have happened in any department, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Finally, what about ministers and their responsibilities? Were you ever concerned that ministers themselves had allowed serious safety failure to occur by reason of inattention?
I don't think there was inattention by ministers during the 2 years that I was in the department before the fire. And I mean, obviously, that'll be a question for them to answer to. But I think, collectively for ministers over these few decades, there was an enthusiasm for better regulation on all sides of the political spectrum, actually, that slightly lost the point about what regulation is for and why we need it, and that it's there to help industries manage their risks better than they can do if everybody acts on their own, and that isn't just good for public safety or whatever else it is that the regulation is there for, it's also good for the industry because, as we know from Grenfell Tower, when these risks crystallise, it's appalling for the industry and very costly. So I think there is something here about why it is that maybe ministers aren't supported or given information sufficiently on, if you like, some of the basic functions of government or of the state, such as regulation, what it's for, how it works, why you need independent regulators, in what circumstances you need independent regulators, why that's the case, and how to then make decisions in light of that.
I mean, if we look back at the email that's still on the screen, or at least it's still on my screen, we can see at the end of the first paragraph, there, that long paragraph, that Steve Quartermain says to Helen McNamara on the 19th of June, he says, I even had a one-to-one with Gavin, I think he means Gavin Barwell, to tell him to pay more attention to the building regulations and energy performance subs. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. Now, were you aware that Mr. Quartermain had to have a word with Mr. Barwell to tell him to pay more attention to those building regulations submissions?
No, I wasn't. I mean, because of Steve's role as chief planner, he probably had more one-to-ones with ministers than any other official in the department, including me. So there was a lot of planning casework, and he was always going to see Gavin and other ministers about that. So he had a lot of opportunity to be raising other issues as part of those meetings, and I can see why, therefore, he might have been able to raise the issues with the building regulations with Gavin. There was something else I was going to mention, which I've temporarily forgotten.
I mean, did you take any steps after the fire to look into whether some of the delays, for example, with Lakanal House, had actually been due to ministers and their special advisors not getting back to people in relation to submissions? Did you actually look at that question?
I didn't particularly look into this, but for me it's fairly clear that there were a lot of bottlenecks on this work. That was something that was a problem for everybody because particularly on anything that was to be published, and that would have included the research,
yes,
the process you had to go through was to get a slot and agreement from number 10. So it had to go all the way to the centre of government, to the communications special advisors in number 10 for sign-off, and that required support from your own special advisors, your own communications team. It was very, was and is, because this is the system today, quite challenging. And I would never have expected Bob and his team to be managing that themselves. They had a lot of support elsewhere in the department to do it, but we did frequently have sweeps of things that were stuck with SPADs, things that were stuck with junior ministers, and in fact there are some where the building regulations were put on that list. Not because those ministers and SPADs were doing their jobs properly, weren't doing their jobs properly, but just because they had a huge weight of work to get through. And it was necessary to just run a system like that every now and then and just flush it out. And then we would work out what to do with it. And in some cases, it would be me going to talk to the Secretary of State and going, look, you've been sitting on this for a while, we really need to do something about it. Or in other cases, it would be talking to the special advisor about what the issues were with number 10. Sometimes I could go to Jeremy Hayward and unblock things. So we had lots of ways that we could deal with stuff that was blocked, and we had processes to try to generate those lists and then to work through them.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I've come to the end of my pre-prepared questions. Perhaps you could have the usual break for me to sweep up questions.
Yes. Well, then, Melanie, as you probably know, when Council gets to the end of her questions, we have a short break to give her a chance to check she's not left anything out, and also to allow other people who are following the proceedings but not from here to suggest questions that perhaps we ought to put to you. So we'll break now. We'll come back at 5:15. Sorry, we're going to run slightly later than usual, but I don't think you'll be too inconvenienced by that.
It's fine.
And we'll see at 5:15 whether there are any more questions. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, thank you. 5:15, please. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Dame Melanie to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Dame Melanie, we'll see if there are any more questions.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Grange?
Yes, thank you. Yes, just a few short questions about building control and in particular the approved inspector scheme. Can we go to a document? This is CLG 1307216. So this is a paper prepared within DCLG in 2015. It's headed The Building Control System in England, Issues and Options. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it addresses, we can see in the executive summary, 3 questions about current building control system. Is building work checked adequately? What's the impact of having competition between local authority and private sector building control bodies? And is the legislation fit for purpose? And if we go on to look at page 6 in this document, at paragraphs 22 and 23, we can see at 22 it says, under the heading, what is the impact of having competition between local authority and private sector building control bodies? It says, this is, so far as we are aware, the only regulatory regime in England that is subject to competition. The impacts on local authority resources and on the extent to which building work is checked have already been discussed above. And then in the beginning of the next paragraph, 23, it says, it is also competition that is not on a completely level playing field. Unlike approved inspectors, local authorities have additional responsibilities relating to dangerous structures, demolition and enforcement, etc. They're also constrained in their charging arrangements. Now, do you agree with this, that permitting the private sector to compete with the public sector in the sphere of building control was unprecedented in terms of regulation?
I haven't seen this document before, by the way. At least I don't think I have. It looks very interesting. I mean, it's clearly unprecedented if the document is correct. Is that there's no, if it's only in England that this happens? So yes.
Yes.
Which was my understanding before.
Yes. Were you aware that by 2015 the government had introduced regulations requiring local authority building control functions to be cost neutral?
No, I wasn't aware of those.
Do you accept that there was a risk that by introducing a competitive element to building control bodies and approved inspectors would join in a race to the bottom, trying to keep work by reducing costs?
I don't think I can really comment on that. I'm just not sufficiently versed in the way the system was operating at the time to be able to say.
Right. Can we agree this, that the government should, at the very least, have been keeping a very close eye on whether these novel arrangements were having a positive or negative impact on the system and thus on building safety?
Yes, I think this is just the sort of thing that proper system oversight would have kept regularly under review, particularly given how unusual it was.
Yes, thank you. Now, my final question, we've been through quite a lot, actually only in one day, which has been a bit of a stretch, but just thinking back, what would you do differently if you had the chance again and knowing what you know now?
Well, I mean, I just first wanted to take the opportunity to, because I haven't really been able to do this yet today, is just to express my condolences to all those affected by the fire in North Kensington that night. You know, it's something which all of us who've worked on this over the last 5 years will always have in our hearts. And today has been an opportunity for me to, go through and really, see once more the extent to which the department failed in a number of its duties over that period. And I can only say, as the most senior official, I think, who you're hearing from in any of the modules, that I deeply regret those failures on behalf of the civil service and of ministers over a number of years. And I was very proud to be a civil servant for 30 years, but there's an awful lot about these episodes which I feel extremely saddened by, and that it's just not the standards I would have expected of government departments. So I won't rehearse again what those failures were, but I think we've gone through them in some detail today, including some of the things that happened on my watch. And I wish that I had managed to go through even more of the department's back doors when I arrived, and to have seen, more of this work, and to have asked questions about it, because I might have been able to help at the margin if I'd done that. And where I did go into some of those back doors on local government finance, I put in place system oversight that has actually been extremely beneficial and helpful in subsequent years. So I regret that, although I can't say that I think that there were very many opportunities where those possibilities were presented to me. But I can only regret that I didn't see more of this work. I think the wider point, though, that I just really passionately believe in, and I believe this as the chief executive of a regulator now, which I'm incredibly proud to be, is that clearly the big failure here for me was the 20 or more year failure, perhaps right back to the mid-1980s, of the department in any of its incarnations to not just act on risks as the department sets out in its witness statement, but to my mind something bigger than the department sets out in its witness statement, which is to fail to recognise that there was such a thing as system stewardship, and a failure to realise that the department was accountable for that, whether that was set out in law or not. Mm-hmm. So I don't view this as a legal issue. I view that as it is a responsibility, as a policy responsibility, an oversight responsibility. I don't think that kind of thing is well understood in government, and I have concluded over the last few years that it is extremely difficult for government departments to manage, on the one hand, serving ministers and helping them take forward their democratically elected commitments, the commitments for which they've been democratically elected, and all of the system management and political management and external engagement that requires. It's very difficult to sit that alongside the kind of long-term, risk-based, technical, deep engagement with the industry, activities that you need to do effective system stewardship and ultimately regulation. And I think there is still a tendency, not just in this department, but in all departments, to view regulation as something where you set the rules and then you worry about who's enforcing them, and not to think about the kinds of things that Judith Hackitt set out in her review about the whole system, about who's actually accountable, how are they informed that they're accountable, how are they trained, who are they advised by, etc., all those issues across the system. I don't think that ministerial departments today have a very good understanding of those things, despite the number of episodes we've had in the past and the failures we've all had to learn from. And I believe all government departments should look again, and I tried to encourage my colleagues to do this when I was still in the civil service, and check that they don't have a building safety sitting in their departmental responsibilities that they have not attended to. And if it's not with a regulator and not being properly overseen from a system perspective, then I would ask that department why they have the rules in the first place. If the rules matter, they should be properly overseen. It doesn't have to be bureaucratic, it doesn't have to be onerous, but somebody has to be thinking about that system, reviewing it, gathering data, and so on. So that's my big lesson, really, from this very difficult set of failures.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, and that just comes to me, and the chairman will thank you in a moment, but thank you so much for coming and for being so candid in your evidence today. It's really, really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Dame Melanie, I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of all three of us on the panel for giving us a lot of your time and for answering questions so candidly. I think I can say we've all found it very interesting and very helpful to hear what you were able to tell us, and it'll be very valuable to us when we come to consider matters for our report. So thank you very much indeed. And now, of course, you're free to go.
Thank you very much. I'm glad it was helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Grange. Well, that's it for the day.
Yes.
And we have another witness tomorrow.
Another government witness tomorrow. Yes.
Right.
Thank
So
you.
we break there and we resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.